This is a reading from Evidence of Satan in the Modern World by Leon Christiani. Possession at Fat Diem. The second case of possession related by Canon Jacquer was a collective one. The facts are recorded in the admirable Bulletin de la Société des Missions étrangères de Paris, published in Hong Kong in the year 1949 to 1950. The writer of the articles was Monsignor de Cuman, now Vicar Apostolic of Tanoa. The possessions occurred in 1924 and 1925 at Fat Diem, in the province of Ninh Binh, Tonkin. The first victim was a young novice of the convent of the Amant de la Croix, an indigenous congregation. It began with violent noises, blows directed at the novice by an unknown hand, volleys of sticks and stones flung not only at Marie Dien, the novice in question, but at all who came to her assistance. In cases of possession, it is not always possible to locate the source of persecution. Later we shall give cases in which the origin of the possession can be clearly traced to the intervention of sorcerers who have made a pact with the devil. In the case of Germaine Selle, the origin lay in sacrilegious communions. In the case of the two Ilfirth boys, it was suggested that the cause could be attributed to a woman suspected of sorcery, who had made the boys eat an apple. In case of Marie Dien, there was a young man of 20 called Min, who had made a pilgrimage to a well-known pagan pagoda to entreat the spirits for the girl's hand. On the 22nd of September, the devil, striking Marie Dien about the face and mouth, declared, "This is the fourth time they've been to the pagoda to ask for your hand. I shall end up by getting you." The strangest forms of persecution continued for more than 2 years, spreading terror amongst the novices, alarming sounds, flying missiles coming from no one knew where, stones, bits of wood, potatoes, empty bottles, or bird cries, the whinnying of horses, hooting of car horns, doors banging, sarcastic laughter, or heart-rending sobs. In a word, all the phenomena we have already encountered in the infestations at Ars. But the most alarming thing was that the other novices began to be affected by some fantastic contagion. They began to climb the areca trees, a kind of palm tree with a slender trunk, attaining a height of 25 to 30 feet. This craze was stopped by nailing little crucifixes to the trunk of each tree. There were fugues which could not be remembered later, but the presence of the devil was clearly evidenced by the knowledge of languages and of secrets which it would have been impossible to discover in any rational way. It was finally decided to proceed to exorcism. There were no less than 14 possessed persons, which reminds one of the historic case of the Ursuline sisters of Loudun in the 17th century. The battle was long and hard. The devil departed, but returned in even more terrifying forms. Finally, however, he yielded to the exorcists. In December 1925, the novices of Fat Diem found their peace assured. In 1949, whilst telling the story of these events, Monsignor de Cuman pointed out that since then an atmosphere of tranquility and piety had never deserted the convent of the Amant de la Croix. 3 of the formerly possessed novices had become the most admirable mothers superior. Marie Dien herself, the first to be persecuted, had later become an excellent mistress of the novices in the convent of Tanoa, where she died in the greatest piety on the 6th of August 1944. This congregation, consisting at the moment of 300 professed nuns, has now, for the most part, taken refuge in South Vietnam, where they continue their mission. Chapter 6. Spellbound in Piacenza. The next case takes us to Italy, and again straight into the 20th century. A very curious case occurred in the district of Piacenza, recorded in a little book by Alberto Vecchio, Intervista col Diavolo, an interview with the devil. And the footnote says, Edizione Pauline, Modena, Italy. One May evening in 1920, a Franciscan friar, Pierpaolo Veronesi, was occupied in the sacristy of the church of the convent of Santa Maria di Campagna at Piacenza, when a woman presented herself asking for a benediction. She asked if this could be given at the altar of the Blessed Virgin. The friar willingly granted this request, which seemed inspired by pure devotion. But he was rather surprised when the woman, whose face was deeply lined with the marks of suffering, asked leave to speak to him for a few minutes in the sacristy. The friar supposed that she had some trouble, some painful task to perform, but he naturally could not refuse the few minutes' conversation she requested. At first in a low voice, but later, as she gained confidence with a little more assurance, she made the most astonishing avowals. At certain times, she said, an unknown force took possession of her and set her whole body in movement against her will. She was then compelled to dance for hours on end, until she dropped down exhausted. She would sing operatic arias that she had never heard. She gave lectures to an imaginary audience in an unknown tongue. Often she felt an uncontrollable impulse to bite to pieces any object that fell into her hands. She would tear her husband's underclothes to shreds. At other times she would behave like a dog, to the great terror of all present, jumping from chair to chair, leaping onto the table, roaring, screaming, mewing, till the house sounded like a zoo. After such terrifying scenes in her own house, she would collapse with fatigue, and for days her body would be bruised and swollen, enough to inspire pity in all who saw her. A final characteristic was that when she was having one of these crises, she would discover shortly afterwards that her parents, although they lived a long way off, had also suffered some disturbance, as though some mysterious fluid flowed between them. Believe me, Father, she concluded, my life is a veritable hell. I have 2 little children, but in spite of them I think only of death as a means of deliverance. The friar was considerably astonished by this story, but as he was an almoner of a mental hospital, he came to the simple conclusion that he was dealing with a mentally unbalanced person. He contented himself with a few questions. Is all this quite correct? Yes, there are many people who can vouch for it. And how long has it lasted? 7 years. And what have the doctors said? I have been to all the doctors in Piacenza, all the doctors I know, and they have all said more or less plainly that it was a case of hysteria. The friar felt reassured, for this was precisely the conclusion he had come to himself. Well then, you know the cause of the trouble? No, because I know perfectly well that I'm neither mad nor hysterical. Well then? Well, replied the woman, seeing that I could get no help from men, I felt the need to take refuge in God. In spite of much repugnance on my part, I have been into all the churches in the town to pray and receive a blessing. Each time I have received the benediction, I have felt better for a few days. But I have visited them so often that I began to be afraid that I should be taken for a madwoman, so I didn't dare to go any more. But something else happened. I had been told that up in the hills there was a parish priest whose blessings were particularly efficacious. I thought I would go and see him. One Sunday after lunch I set off with my husband and some relatives in a carriage which the commune of St. Giorgio had lent me. The horse was a good one, and we covered the ground quickly. Suddenly he stopped and refused to go any further. They whipped him till they drew blood. He reared and kicked and struggled, but would not move forward. Then, without knowing what was happening to me, I jumped down from the carriage, although my relatives tried to hold me back, and I began to fly. It's the only word I can use to describe it. About 2 feet from the ground, right across the fields and up the hill in the direction of the church spire in the parish we were going to. The congregation was just coming out from the evening service. They all saw me coming towards the church. Dogs were barking, hens scattering in every direction. I reached the square and everyone left it. With bowed head, I slipped through the half-closed door of the church and threw myself down at the foot of the high altar, on which was a painting of Saint Expedit. The priest, followed by the crowd, rushed in and, seeing what had happened, gave me his blessing. Then I came to myself, and for days afterwards I felt better. The story only served to confirm Father Pierpaolo's suspicions. Yes, it's all very strange, he remarked uncertainly. It's all very strange. Then he bade his visitor goodbye, saying, Listen, since the benediction helps you, don't hesitate to come here whenever you feel like it. If I'm not here myself, one of my colleagues will always bless you. A significant episode. Several days passed. The woman came back for a blessing. But whilst Brother Pierpaolo was in the course of pronouncing the benediction before the altar of the Madonna, the woman, who was leaning against a pillar near the choir, began to whimper with closed mouth, like a dog having bad dreams. Then, with closed eyes, her head pressed back against the pillar, her hands clasped, she began to intone a tremendous chant. Her voice was rich, passionate, brilliant in tone, and all the children of the neighborhood crept in to listen. When she had finished, she began to speak in an unknown language, and although she did not change her position, seemed to be struggling against some invisible power. Her voice rose to a pitch of fury, like that of a maniac in a paroxysm of rage. At this particular moment, another priest was passing through the church, Father Apollinare Focaccia. He listened first to the chant, and then to the imprecations in the unknown language. That evening, he remarked to his colleague, "You noticed that woman?" "Yes, why? Weren't you impressed?" "To tell the truth, not particularly. As almoner in a mental hospital, I've got used to that sort of thing. I think you should pay attention. I'm certain that woman is possessed." "Don't let's exaggerate," replied Father Pierpaolo. "One shouldn't go looking for the devil everywhere, like the people who use the devil to explain things which have a perfectly normal explanation. And then, in any case, what we can't explain today, science will no doubt explain tomorrow." "I can't agree with you," answered Father Apollinare. "Just think it over. How can you explain her being able to talk in an unknown language? We can see for ourselves that what she is doing is very mysterious, and this mystery comes from the devil." "Dear Father Apollinare, come and pay a visit to the psychiatric ward, and I will show you some very interesting cases which are not yet amenable to scientific explanation." "I shall be glad to do so, but tell me, have you ever seen a case that resembled this one, even distantly?" "Frankly, no." "Then, with all respect to science, we are entitled to suppose there might be demonic intervention. This person seems quite normal, but there is a personality within her, quite different from her own. You heard her sing. There isn't a single singer alive today who could sing like that. And what about all that strange torrent of abuse in some unknown tongue? Nothing will stop me thinking that she is possessed. I don't mean we've got to be positively medieval. We don't have to see witchcraft and sortileges everywhere, but I don't see why we should claim to know more about it than the evangelists, than Jesus Christ, or St. Peter and St. Paul, who were extremely precise when they said that the devil was an actual being. You remember how St. Paul in the epistle to the Ephesians declared that devils were in the air? We have known about this phenomenon of possession from remote antiquity onwards. That is why the Church created an order of exorcists. Take our own missionaries, who say the devil is very active amongst people still living in the darkness of idolatry. Can we doubt that he also operates amongst peoples of Christendom, now that so many of them have abandoned the faith of their fathers? Father Apollinaire continued to develop his argument. Pierpaolo was a little shaken, but not yet convinced. "All that is very true, dear Father, but I'm not arguing about doctrine, only about facts, and I'm not persuaded that this woman is truly possessed." The bishop's opinion. The following morning, Father Pierpaolo, troubled by some scruples of conscience with regard to the previous evening's discussion, asked for an interview with his bishop, Monsignor Pellizzari, and told him the story in full detail. After thinking it over for a moment or two, the bishop replied simply, "My dear Father, have her exorcised." "Excellency," replied the priest hastily, "is that really necessary?" "Yes," replied the bishop without hesitation. "And I have to do it?" "Yes, you." "You couldn't perhaps find someone else?" "Either you or Monsignor Mosconi, the vicar general, but it had better be you, since you know the woman." "Forgive me, Excellency, but I've heard it said that during the exorcism the devil turns against the exorcist and invents all sorts of disagreeable stories about him. If this woman is really possessed, but who will believe in what the devil says? Don't you know that he is the father of lies?" At last, Father Pierpaolo had to give way to the bishop's wish. Returning home, he was considerably perturbed. He felt it was a dangerous adventure to confront the devil. He was an excellent priest, but somewhat timorous and not a little frightened at having to engage in a conflict of which the outcome was most uncertain. But the bishop's order was explicit. He submitted. He prayed, he slept a little, and began to prepare himself for the task which had devolved upon him. In the morning, he went to see Dr. Lupi, superintendent of the mental hospital, to whom he explained the problem at length. Dr. Lupi was so interested in the story that he asked if he could be present at the exorcism, which was precisely what the priest had hoped. The first exorcism. The first exorcism took place on the 21st of May, 1920, in a room on the first floor above the chapel. The possessed woman was accompanied by her husband, her mother, a friend of the family, and two ladies. The friar was assisted by a colleague, Father Giustino, whose duty it was to take note of the proceedings, and by Dr. Lupi, the medical superintendent. On their knees in front of a small altar, the two priests first recited the litanies of the saints, as laid down by the ritual. The possessed woman, seated on a rush-bottomed chair, stretched herself like a wild beast waking from sleep. Suddenly there resounded the Latin text of the first words of the exorcism, Exorcizio te, mundissime spiritus, omne phantasma, omnis legio. At these words, the possessed woman took hold of the points of her shoes, rose in the air with a leap of extraordinary agility, landed in the middle of the room, relaxed her grasp, and stood upright. Her whole body was totally transformed. Her face had taken on a hideous aspect. She began to scream insults at the exorcist in a harsh, piercing, and totally unfeminine voice. And who are you to come and fight with me? Do you know who I am? I, Isabo. I have great wings and strong fists. Then another string of abusive epithets flowed from her lips. The priest, dazed, astonished, quite disconcerted, was for a moment reduced to silence. But soon he recovered strength without knowing how, and called out loudly, I, priest of Christ, I command you, whoever you may be, I command you in the name of the mysteries of the Incarnation, of the Passion, and the Resurrection of Jesus Christ, and by his coming for the last judgment, to hold your peace, to harm no creature of God, and particularly none of those present, and to do everything I command you. Then, in an atmosphere of intense emotion, the following dialogue began. In the name of God, who are you? Isabo, cried the woman, her eyes flaming and her face flushed. What does this name mean? Instead of replying, the woman began to bite at her hands and arms and tried to catch hold of the priest's robe. Finally, she said, the name means that he is properly spellbound, that no one can resist him. How great is your power? As much as I am given. How much are you given? A great deal. Where do you get it from? From the person who knows how to cast spells. What sort of Italian is that? I am not Italian, screamed the woman, or rather the spirit that possessed her, with an expression of contempt, spitting out a new stream of insults, something that she did repeatedly in the course of the exorcism. Where do you come from? Asked the priest, unperturbed. You are talking to me as if I were your slave. Tell me where you come from. No. In the name of God, of the God you know so well, tell me where you come from. At the mention of God, the woman turned her face away like a bull which had been hit on the muzzle, and for a moment she remained motionless, refusing to reply. The onlookers were holding their breath, overcome by the solemnity of the scene. In the name of God, by the blood of his crucifixion, tell me where you come from. From the distant desert. Are you alone, or are there companions with you? I have companions. How many? After a momentary hesitation, the devil replied, 7, and gave their names, as strange as his own. Why did you enter into this body? Because of a violent love which was not returned. Not returned by whom? You are a fool. Answer me, who did not return this love? This body, screamed the woman, beating her breast violently. And why did you not return it? In a proud and disdainful voice, the woman replied, because it was not right. So this body became your victim? In sole response to this question, the woman screwed up her face into an expression of animal ferocity, and from between her thin, tightly compressed lips, there came a burst of terrifying laughter, which made the bystanders shudder. When did you enter this body? After many contortions, there came the reply, in 1913, on the 23rd of April, at 5 in the evening. The exorcist plied her with questions until the spirit was obliged to admit that on that day he had entered into her by means of a sortilege contrived by a wizard in the form of a bolus of salt pork washed down by a glass of white wine. In the course of this exorcism, the friar asked if it was true that the devil had equally invaded the rest of the family, and the reply was that he had done so. A case of telepathy, suggested the priest. Idiot, retorted retorted the devil. But when the exorcist ordered Isabo to leave the body he was possessing, he shouted, "No!" "Leave," thundered the priest. "Never. I command you to go." "I am not going. I am Isabo." In a paroxysm of rebellion, the woman freed herself from all constraint, and with wild cries and outstretched hands flung herself at the priest, caught hold of his gown, tearing at his stole, and screaming like a beast in torment. "It took 7 days to get me into this body, and you want to get me out with a single exorcism." It was a critical moment. The doctor, impassive, kept his eyes fixed on the possessed woman. The friar sprinkled her with holy water, and she threw herself twisting and writhing on the ground, as if she had been sprinkled with burning embers. "When will you leave?" asked the priest. "What can I do?" asked the spirit on a note of profound sadness, "since whilst you are working to get me out, others are working to keep me in." "Leave," cried the priest, putting an end of his stole on the woman's shoulder. At contact with the stole, the woman leapt to her feet like a gazelle and began to shout in terror, "Take that weight off me!" And she ran towards the door. The exorcism continued. The devil had declared that he would not only leave if the mouthful of salt pork which had constituted the sortilege were thrown up. But although they brought her a basin, the woman could not do so. Several times she seemed to throw up something, and it was never the food taken at her last meal. To the question as to which words made him suffer most, after many refusals and continued pressure from the exorcist, the devil finally replied in obvious terror, whilst the bystanders waited in hushed silence, "Sanctus, Sanctus, Sanctus." It was, in fact, observed in the course of subsequent exorcisms that these 3 words that we call in the liturgy the trisagion, always produced a devastating effect upon the demon. Whilst he was uttering these words, the devil interspersed them with wails, which filled everyone with terror. Even Dr. Lupi stood pale and trembling. This first exorcism lasted until the evening. The poor woman was utterly exhausted, and Friar Pierpaolo hardly less so. He pronounced the final adjuration to the devil that he was to do no harm, either to the possessed woman or to her family. Having promised this, with a sulky, furtive look at the priest, his eyes seemed to travel round the room in pursuit of some invisible cavalcade of specters. There was one convulsion, and his manifestations ended. The woman appeared to emerge from a profound sleep. She was pale but normal. She was no doubt suffering from great lassitude, but remembered nothing of what had taken place. The session was over. "Well, Brother Pierpaolo," asked Father Apollinaire, "what happened?" "This woman is truly possessed," answered the exorcist. He could no longer doubt, but he was alarmed at the power of his adversary. "It is incredible," he added, "the extent to which the forces of evil can resist the influences we can bring to bear on them." And with bent head he returned to his cell, in the hope of finding a little of the repose he so badly needed. His colleague, Father Giustino, had taken note of all that happened, and it is from this shorthand record that Alberto Vecchio derived the story.